Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Big Data SIG webinar. I've got presenter Jeff Popova-Clark from PwC and also our SIG convener Peter Gorham. As always, today's very interactive. You'll see Q&As on the screen, as well as you can use the chat, and we'll also send up a poll question throughout it. So I might quickly pass over to Peter, and then we can go pass over to you, Jeff.
Good stuff. Thanks, Ross, and welcome to the webinar today, everyone. Last month we had Juan Vasquez talking about how to use big data techniques to essentially provide cost savings and efficiencies over raw geographic data for land parcels. So today I think is very interesting because Jeff is going to talk about, an example of predictive analytics that is not solely based on saving money or earning money. It's about something else. So welcome today, Jeff, and thanks very much for taking this session today.
Thanks, Peter. And we love the agility, mate. On the way home from the airport in an Uber. It's awesome. Thank you.
In the tunnel too.
Yeah, great. Go for it, Jeff. It's over to you, mate.
Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. This should be something a little bit different, hopefully, that should make you start hitting Google to find some more information out. Basically, it's from the areas of cognitive science, which has a lot to do on the artificial intelligence side of big data, but also has a lot to do, once you see this, with regards to how to improve our own techniques within the big data realm. So let's begin. What we're going to go through is what is forecasting, basically, a bit of a primer and why it's so good. What is super forecasting specifically? How could it be useful to you? And finally, what you should do next with this information. All right, so you've probably all seen this set of stats from Standish Group that comes out every year. Makes you cry almost every year because the proportion of projects that fail is always more than 50%. Last year's Standish Group report came out with a 16.2% large IT projects completed on budget and on time. We've tried lots of things. We've tried Prince2, we've tried PMBOK, we've tried change management, you name it. We've tried everything under the book to try and make this number get bigger and bigger. It just doesn't. It actually gets worse. So what is the reason why we have such a high failure rate when we in turn call that because of the fact that it's on time and on budget being our definition of success? Well, it's nothing to do with what we actually do during projects. The problem is our expectations are being set during the planning phase. We're overconfident. What we're doing is we're doing a bad piece of forecasting. We're believing that we can get things done at an incredibly low budget and an incredibly short time frame. That's why we're doing so poorly. So that's the part we need to improve. Secondly, here's another little story. A guy called Dan Kahneman, you may have heard of him. He was a Nobel Prize winning economist. He went into a Wall Street firm and he saw there was this beautiful leaderboard. And in that leaderboard, there was a bunch of people who were performing well above the market over the last 12 months. And there was some that were below market, a bit of a distribution across that. And he saw that some of the ones that were doing well above market were doing fantastically well. So the first question he asked the senior executive of that organisation was, so how many of the people who are at the top this year were on the top last year? And they said, a couple, not many. He went, that's interesting. So it's not the same bunch year in, year out that do well. Anyway, so have you got that information? Well, they didn't have it directly to hand, so he had to do a project, but he managed to get his hands on the data from the previous years. And he demonstrated that year in, year out, stockbrokers, fund managers, people who've got access to our money, and trillions of dollars of it, you'll see in a minute, are actually very, very bad at outperforming the market. In fact, the correlation from one year to the next is less than 1%, which means it's just random. So anyone who happens to be doing well this year is not doing well next year. So they're doing a terrible job at forecasting the area that we're paying them to forecast, which is how well stocks and bonds and et cetera are going to go next year. That doesn't stop us. Well, this is just the US. $7.5 trillion is given to these people to look after. 7.5 trillion is a pretty big number. And that's how much money, that's just US fund managers alone. It's bigger worldwide. I don't know what the figure is, but it'll at least be double that. The key is that we're giving this money to these people that we think are expert at predicting the future, but they're not. They're just doing randomly. These same cognitive neuroscientists have done the work for not just investment managers, but political commentators, economists, intelligence analysts, journalists, doctors with regards to your medical outcomes, marketers. In fact, marketers do worse than your average person on the street when it comes to their prediction of how well products are going to go. Even wine connoisseurs who are trying to predict the next 5 years of the price of wine, sorry, don't do as well as a simple algorithm that knows how much it rained in the relevant regions in the last couple of years. I'm afraid the entire forecasting industry is a sham. That's what it means. So why are experts so bad at predicting? If you stare at this one long enough, it's like watching fire, you'll get into a hypnotic trance. So I don't recommend that we stay on this one for too long. But basically, you start with groupthink. So it's like an echo chamber. If we start thinking things together, we start agreeing with each other, and we all want to get along. So we start talking about the same things, and we start convincing each other of things. More importantly, no one gives any feedback. So we don't give feedback to people about how well their forecasting went. So no one goes back to those stockbrokers and says, well, you said out of these 50 that these would all do better than the market, but only 25 of them did. What's going on? So they're not getting the feedback about how well they're doing. On top of that, we have the desire to influence others. Now, if you're saying radical things, I'm probably saying radical things now, I'm sure that some of the people are getting offside. So that's what ends up happening. If you start saying radical things, then people don't like you so much, and you worry about your professional reputation. On top of that, we can't forget that we're just human beings. We evolved over millions of years. We grew up in the African savannas, so we're very good at spotting lions and eagles. We're very good at spotting loafers within our tribe. We're good at looking at things and making decisions about whether or not they're poisonous to eat. But we're not so good at living within our modern society. We've only had this modern society for a short period of time. There's been no time for evolution to catch up, but we've got a brain from the African savannah that's trying to live in this modern world. So our average human being, we're all human beings, we forget things like regression to the mean. That's a statistical bias. So things like if Messi kicks 3 goals in a match, we think he's on fire. But the facts are, he's just got a hot streak and he's pretty good. He happened to get 3 goals. That doesn't mean he's going to get 3 goals in the next match. It just means that he's been above average and he's going to regress to the mean next time. So this kind of thinking, even trained statisticians aren't very good at it. We can't help ourselves. We're human. There's a whole stack of natural human cognitive biases that make it very difficult for us to think logically and rationally. And so here's a couple of them here. I'm not going to go through the entire list. It would take us too long, but here's a couple. Anchoring and loss avoidance. So take for instance, if I was to offer you, okay, you can pay me $500 and I'll give you a 1 in 100 chance of winning 25 grand. Okay, if anyone wants to take that, they can. Just poll me right now. Give me the $500 and I'll give you a 1 in 100 chance of 25 grand. The reason I'd take that is because I'd come out in front on average. But you know what? Very few of you would actually take that. But funnily enough, you do take it every year because you pay $500 for your car insurance, and your chances of getting paid out for a crashed car is about 1 in 100. So just because of the fact that we've changed it around from being a gain to a loss, you've changed your mind about whether or not that's a good deal. It doesn't make any sense. It's not rational, but all us humans do it. Habit and cognitive laziness. What some of the cognitive researchers have shown recently is we've basically got 2 brains. We've got one brain which is very irrational. It's actually racist. It works very fast. It never stops. It makes all our decisions for us. It decides whether something's going to be yummy or not. It makes these decisions very rapidly, and you're not even aware you do it. You make the decisions with this piece of your brain before you're cognitively aware of it. the other part of your brain is like a lazy Einstein. It's able to be rational. It can overcome its tendencies and biases, but it takes a lot of effort, and it's really lazy. It doesn't like to do it, so it deploys most of the decision making back to the automatic part of your brain. So that's the part that has the habits in it. So unfortunately, the vast majority of us walk around like zombies, making decisions using our habits and our irrational brain all the time, and very rarely do we put our rational part of our brain, the one you can actually hear in your head, we don't put that to use very often. When we do, it does a good job, but it's how often we do it, and that's part of the problem. And we're all humans, so we all have this issue. Bias to confirmatory evidence. Just go and talk to anyone who thinks that maybe their Apple phone's better than the Samsung phone, or their Samsung phone's better than the Apple phone. If you think Google's better than Apple, you're going to keep looking for confirmatory evidence that your Google Samsung is better than the Apple phone. And if you have an Apple phone, you'll be the other way around. We're all the same. We look for confirmatory evidence. What you should do is, if you actually, and this is what scientists do, if you particularly like Samsung phones, you should test yourself out and look for biases towards good Apple. And if Apple happens to start showing good, maybe you should change your mind. That's not how us humans tend to work. We tend to work by constantly searching to make ourselves feel good about things. Correlation causation fallacy. Billions of dollars have been made with this one. There's so many examples. I'll choose one that's been demonstrated. There's a thing called HDLs and LDL cholesterol. HDL cholesterol is supposedly the good cholesterol. There are products out there that can actually raise your HDL levels. But the facts are, there's been no evidence to show that actually raising your HDL cholesterol makes you any more safe from heart attack or decreases your expectancy, your life, or increases your life expectancy. So basically, what the problem there is that just because heart attacks happen to be on average with people with lower levels of HDL, that is some research there. There's no demonstration that a drug-based modification of that HDL level is actually going to cause you a heart attack. So this kind of correlation causation fallacy gets really obvious when you start giving. That was a little bit funny, that one, because you mightn't have agreed with it. But let me give you one that's almost exactly the same. What you'll find is, if you do a geoposition analysis of where firefighters happen to go, they happen to go on the same date as where all the fires are. So therefore, we can tell that if you know where the firefighters are, if you take the firefighters and put them in one spot, then you're going to decrease the number of fires. Well, that's obviously rubbish, but it's exactly the same thinking that got you to the point of making the HDLs change with your drugs. So this is the kind of thinking that makes a lot of people a lot of money. Anyway, I could keep going on all day. There are thousands of these human cognitive biases. In fact, here's a little chart of one. This is all the ways your brain fools you into thinking it's being rational. There's a link to this sheet, and it gets very interesting as you go through them, and you can click on the links and find out what each of those are if you're that interested. But every single human being has these problems. Now, we can put effort in to try and overcome them, but it is effort. We have to engage that rational brain, and it's a lazy piece of your brain. So you want to make sure you put your effort in the right time. But this is what I'm trying to say is, this is why we're not very good at forecasting. Now, so getting off the whole track of why we're no good at it, let's have a look at where the opportunities are. Now, back in the old days, predicting a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse would have been a fantastically beneficial thing. You would have made lots of money out of it. But these days, it's fully predictable. We have all the data. We know what the equations are. We can predict this down to the second. In fact, the next one in Brisbane is in 2028, for those who are in southeast Queensland. We know that because we've got all of the relevant data and the algorithms to do it. I'm not going to make any money out of the fact that I know it's 2028, because it's very easy to find out. So fully predictable. If everyone knows it and everyone can do it, then you're not going to get much money out of that. Totally unpredictable. So when and where is the next meteor strike going to hit? Well, no one knows that, and no one can know that at the moment. So when's the next earthquake? Very similar problem. We just don't know. And it doesn't matter how good you are at predicting. It doesn't matter how bad you are at predicting. We're all going to do about the same. We're going to have no idea. where your real value is going to be somewhere in the middle, somewhere between partially predictable and almost predictable. So that's the area where you should be concentrating on, and that's the area where being better at predicting than everybody else is going to be of value to you. So just as an example, and I won't spend too long on this, but imagine this was the actuals that you got for, say, sales over a 9-month period, but your forecasts were saying something along these lines. That would have been quite useful, because you can see as it was starting to drop through 2 to 4, you got a drop in your forecast. So you could have made some adjustments to your inventories. You could see there was an increase in month 5. So this was a fairly useful set of forecasts. As you went further out, you can see that, yeah, it got a little bit far away, especially in month 6, but it showed a decrease. So this would be a useful forecast. However, if you're able to just improve that a little bit, a super forecast, as you might want to call it, not much different at the beginning, but towards the end, you're starting to see real improvements, still not getting any of them accurate. In fact, our blue one hit number 5 on the smacker, whereas the red one doesn't get any of them right. But anyone who has access to a super forecast of the red would vastly outperform the persons with the access to a blue one. And so what this is saying is that there is real advantage in understanding, being able to forecast into the future if you can do it. So if our super forecasted performance is able to get from, say, 80% to 95% on the partially predictables and from 25 to 50% on the almost predictables, there's going to be significant competitive advantage. And remember, we don't need to beat the bear, okay? We just need to be better than our competitors. So there's some real opportunities out there if you can improve the forecasting of your organisation. And that's not just for super forecasting, but also in the big data realm as well. Okay, so let's get to a super forecasting. Okay, I can't do the sound effects very well, but basically, Iraq War, you guys might have remembered the thing called the Iraq War from roughly 15 years ago. What was happening there was the US president and various functionaries in the US government were told by the intelligence agencies that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They were given this. It wasn't definite, wasn't 100%, but they were pretty certain that it was there. And they launched an invasion. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives as a result of this war over years. It cost billions of dollars. And so it was a big decision to go in. They scoured the country for years. No weapons of mass destruction were found. So this was a major embarrassment to the intelligence community. Which includes ones such as the CIA, FBI. Now these days we've got the NSA, we've got the home security ones. So there's plenty of intelligence agencies. And what they decided to do was to they learnt from their cousins in the defence. So that's the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force, etc., and the Marines. They had a thing called DARPA. Now you've probably heard of DARPA. DARPA are the ones that basically invented the internet. And they also are the ones you probably see all those robot videos where there's the robots competing against each other. They're mainly DARPA tournaments, and the driverless vehicle tournaments as well. Many of those were driven by DARPA. Anyway, so they formed their own version called IARPA. So essentially it's the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency, in order to try and find out if there's ways that they could do better at undertaking intelligence activity so that mistakes such as the Iraq War wouldn't happen again. And the first thing they did was launch a project which was about forecasting. So they invited a bunch of universities from America, and they asked them several hundred questions about the future. Now, they had to change things a little bit, because most people who forecast the future say, oh yeah, look, the economy is going to get worse over in the future. So the problem with that is, well, how much worse? When's it going to happen? By what point in time can we say that it's going to reduce by a certain amount? So in order to improve things, they went back to a thing called the Breyer School, and that basically allows you to assess whether or not a forecast has been accurate. But for that, you need to make sure that your numbers that your forecasts are quite specific. So if your question is something along the lines of what's the probability that your actual forecast that it's going to rain today. So if you're going to say it's 80% likely and it does actually rain, well then you're off by 0.2. And then the Breyer score just squares that, so it's 0.04. So that's a really good Breyer score. The lower the better, it's like golf. But if you said 80% likely to rain and it doesn't rain, then you're a long way off. So you get 0.8 squared, so it's 0.64. That's a terrible Breyer score. So the idea is now we've got a way of keeping score of people who do forecasts. And that's what they did. And they gave it to these universities, and they formed teams. And here's some of the results. The Good Judgment Project, which was run by Professor Philip Tetlock and his partner Barbara Mellers within the University of Philadelphia, they formed a team called Good Judgment, and that particular team did very, very well in year one. In fact, it did so well, it outperformed IAPA's goals for the first year, the second year, and the third and fourth years as well, all in the first year. This is over hundreds of forecasts. And the second best team did less than half as well on the Breyer score forecasting. So they did the thing again the next year, and everyone expected, like normally happens, as you did with the Dan Kahneman thing, Wall Street, these GJP people, the Good Judgment people, they'd come back to the pack. But no, the opposite happened. They actually got better. The rest got a little bit better as well, but not as well as they were hoping. So the GJP team still outperformed the next best team by more than double. But what was more amazing was that by now, Good Judgment people who only had access to publicly available information were now outperforming the intelligence agents who had access to classified information. So only what was Googleable was available to the Good Judgment Project, and yet they outperformed them. Now this is not a bunch of data scientists who are sitting there crunching numbers in ways that no one had ever done before. These were just people who happened to be good at the job of forecasting, being put together in clever ways. So Professor Tetlock, he's an academic, can't help himself. He's got this bunch of really good forecasters, and he wanted to know what made them better or different to your average person on the street at forecasting. Why were they so continually better? So he got his top 2%, which using some of his algorithms and his crowd forecasting algorithms, he'd been weighting most of his team's results upon. And he found out a few things about these people. Firstly, they're very cautious. They understand that few things are certain. So even if it does rain or that particular football team does win, they don't think that they know why. They think they've got some theories about it, but that doesn't mean that they know exactly why this thing happened. They're very humble about their own understanding of the world and their own understanding of how things are fitting together. And on top of that, they're very open-minded to different hypotheses. So they don't come in with this theory, all-knowing theory that will always work, and then presume that everything will work precisely as that particular theory goes. They're open-minded. They're very intellectually curious. They're people with good back-of-the-envelope skills. They love synthesizing lots of different ideas, very probability focused. So they're quite happy to handle uncertainty. So they don't feel the need to say, this will happen, this won't happen. They can go, well, it's about 70, 78%. That's what we reckon is going to happen. So an unusual bunch of people that generally don't do very well within the corporate setting because they annoy people. Okay, so, and the other thing he did is he didn't just look at what the capabilities of these people were, he also looked at how they went about doing their forecasting. And here's some of the examples. And you too can pick up some of these techniques and apply them. And I highly recommend, and I'll show you why in a few minutes, that you should be applying them within your data analytics type work, especially big data work. So one of the big ones is breaking up the problems into parts. So a classic one here would be if someone asks you, can you try and forecast or estimate how many piano tuners there are in Sydney? You go, well, I got no idea. Well, maybe the best way would be to break it up and say, okay, we've got roughly 2.5 million people in Sydney. Great. All right. How many households would that be? Well, there's roughly 2 people per household on average. So that's maybe about 1 million households. Okay. So what we're doing is we're breaking this problem up. All right. How many households, what average proportion of households might have a piano? Maybe 1 in 100. Okay. So we're down to 10,000 households with pianos. So what you can see is we're breaking the problem up into bite-sized chunks which are doable, and we eventually get to the point where we can work out, the number of hours it takes to tune a piano, how long it might take to get there, how many hours in a day a piano tuner might work, and you can use all these bits and pieces and come up with an answer. In fact, when that particular question was asked, a group of people were able to come up who had no understanding of piano tuners, and they were able to then check it. They got within 20 to 30% of the real answer. So it's a very, very useful thing to do. You start with the outside view and then adjust with the inside views. So too many people look at a question and then they will decide on building up from the top, and this is where your project planning problem comes. People say, right, we're going to do what the user requirements are. That's going to take roughly 2 weeks. Then we're going to do the specifications, technical specifications. Okay, that's going to take us roughly 3 weeks. And they do a bottom-up type assessment. So that's using what's called the inside view. The outside view would be coming into a project and saying, right, we're doing a project which is, going to be going into an organisation that's roughly 50 years old. It's got major legacy systems. What does a project of that kind, that's maybe an ERP, what does that normally take most organisations? And then you might come back and realise, well, wow, 80-odd% of them end up going over budget and over time. We now have some idea of the amount that is, so we'll adjust our estimate back to the typical that would be on those kinds of projects. That's called an outside view. So the idea is you start with your outside view and then you adjust it. This is very atypical for us humans to do it this way, but this is how the super forecasters do it. Always consider the antithesis. I sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the idea is that if you've got a thesis that maybe Google's better than Apple, well then just imagine for a second that Apple's better than Google, and you're going to look for evidence of that. So always looking for evidence that you're wrong, not evidence that you're right. Practice forecasting to habitualize required thinking skills. This is really important. So the more you do forecasting and get feedback about how well you've done, the better you're going to get at it. And the things you're going to realize are helping you get better at forecasting. So the best way to get good at forecasting is to practice. Using the wisdom of crowds if possible. So the great thing about crowds is that you've got people with a very large level of experience. You can't just throw them in a room and expect them to come up with an answer though. You've got to allow them to put their estimate in and look at the distribution of estimates. And what you'll get from that is a wisdom of crowds estimate. What they did within the Good Judgment Project is they biased those, so they put more weighting onto the estimates of those people that they knew were super forecasters. So it's like a weighted wisdom of crowds estimate. Identify good questioners. So the kinds of people that I was having a bit of a go at before, and they're the ones that have their special theory that they just know this is how the world works. I know if we reduce taxes that we're going to get an economic increase, and because it worked, I really believe that. So I'm a hedgehog now. What I'm doing is I've got my theory, and doesn't matter what comes, I'm going to keep interpreting everything from that one particular lens. Isaiah Berlin had this particular short essay roughly 70 years ago where he put hedgehogs and foxes against each other. Foxes are more like your super forecasters. They're not absolutely certain about anything. They make their decisions based on what they see in front of them, whereas the hedgehogs have got this one theory that they always keep using. So look, once again, we could go through this list and keep going. I've put this in the set of slides so that you guys can download them and you can go through each of them. More than happy to talk to anyone. to explain what these are. But if you follow these processes, what you'll be doing is you'll be following the processes of the super forecasters. Now, a very important point about, now, I won't go through these 10 commandments, mainly because they're similar, but these are the ones from Philip Tetlock himself, to give you some idea of what it is that he believes is a step-by-step process of improving your forecasting. One of the things I wanted to do is to look at, if you go through the literature over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a number of articles in Harvard Business Review and various other data focused journalism areas about what makes a great data scientist. Now, this isn't just what makes a data scientist different to your average IT person or your average business person, but what makes one data scientist better than another data scientist. So if you go through the literature, the kinds of things that I see in the green circle here, or oval, are the ones that they come up with. Obviously, they're awesome at scripting and coding. They're very knowledgeable about the business they're working in, and they're very creative. But they're also humble before the data, analytically minded. They're persistent. They never give up. They show true grit. They're innate probabilistic thinkers, right? Comfortable with uncertainty. These things, you're probably hearing them again because that's how I was describing super forecasters. Super forecasters would make great data scientists if you could teach them the skills of the coding and the statistical capabilities, because they've got the general makeup of what you need. And that said, if you're someone with the knowledge about the business and you're an excellent coder, and then picking up the super forecaster techniques is going to make you a much better data scientist. So I think this is a very important thing to bring across. Now, the super forecasters themselves, and Philip Tetlock probably wouldn't like this diagram so much. The stuff on the green is just a bunch of journalists who have come up with these attributes off the top of their heads, whereas the super forecaster stuff was done in an academic setting. It was actually done through proper academic research, so empirically demonstrated attributes. But nevertheless, I think it's a useful thing to note. The two so greatly overlap. Okay, so how is this useful? Is there any questions, by the way? I haven't seen any questions popping up yet.
No, yeah, everyone, feel free to send any through, but that's good. Good. No questions sometimes means you're saying everything we need, so just keep chipping along there, Jeff. It's great.
Even though they've all fallen asleep, mate.
Oh, no, not at all. It's very in-depth. It's fantastic. Go for it.
Okay, so when is super forecasting useful? You sort of saw the continuum I was showing you before between the too easy and the too hard. So obviously in the too easy, you've got things like life insurance or linear optimization problems and mean time to failure. Those kinds of things, we've got mathematical algorithms that can do that. And obviously as we're moving a little bit more to the right, big data comes into its own. It's where things aren't 100% certain. You can't come up with a 100% accurate assessment, but you can use your data far more effectively using very large quantities of data or statistical algorithms or a combination of both, and you can move things to the left to get more certain. However, there's still a lot left where super forecasting comes in, and you just need your human intuition. Things like where a big portion of what it is you're putting into there is your understanding of the world and how it works. So where there's a very large amount of hypotheses going into the model, where the data is a bit inconsistent and seems to be showing things that are inconsistent with each other. So your big data algorithms aren't getting sufficient variation, consistent variation to be able to make predictions. These kinds of things is where your super forecasting comes into its own. Obviously, all the way to the right, it just gets too hard. It doesn't matter if you're a super forecaster, or your average person, or just a random dart throwing chimp. It won't help you. They're just too hard. So the kinds of stuff that's in the middle is the interesting stuff. What's the risk of lending to this borrower? So is this borrower likely to continue paying their repayments over the life of the loan? That is a forecast. How long will this project take or cost? I've already talked about that quite a bit. And this is the biggest problem we have in our project planning at the moment. We are far too conservative in our expectations of what things are going to cost and how long they're going to take. What's the likelihood this project will succeed is another one. Will customers purchase this new product we've just created? Will the economy go into recession? These are forecastable. We will never be 100% certain about them, but we can be better than our competitors on these kinds of things. Will this particular job applicant become a high performer? What's the prognosis of this patient given this constellation of symptoms? These are all forecasts about the future. Will this movie or song be a blockbuster? So, there are algorithms that can help us with this sort of stuff, but at the end of the day, super forecasters are likely to bring that little piece of human assessment into that as well. And it's probably a good time for our poll, because we're about to launch into what I think is where organisations would benefit from improved forecasting. But it'd be good to go to the audience and see what parts of the business they think could benefit from improved forecasting. Let's give you a minute or two to have a go at that.
That's great. Now, a lot of comments about it's a very new concept and a way of thinking for a lot of the participants today, Jeff. How would you suggest people adapted these principles, or where would you start if this was quite new and to you?
Yeah, well, so probably Google is your friend, so I would certainly jump on, have a look at what super forecasting is, and Philip Tetlock, there's some links within this presentation here that will help you find some of that. You can, I would personally begin to utilise, and there's a particular slide in this pack which talks about the things you personally can do within your organisation to get better at forecasting. Yeah. Start small within your organisation. So pick an area where you think that this sort of stuff is vastly going to improve. And I think big data is a great place to start. Yeah. And so a number of the people on this particular audience would be in that area. Yeah. And start to apply some of these techniques, and that should improve the quality of your modelling off the bat.
Yeah. So I'll share.
I think Jeff, I'll just chime in there, and I saw something recently where they said there's nothing wrong with doing linear regression as a first step, but I think what the point you're trying to make today is just change the assumptions and argue the against rather than the for.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Look, what you should always do with things like your linear regression is realise that is one way of looking at the data and one way of coming up with hypotheses about your information. And what you should do is once you've got those, then start trying to prove yourself wrong. So if you for instance, suddenly find out that a vast increase in the number of calls from your call centre seems to predict the likelihood that someone's about to leave from your subscription business, well then ask yourself, okay, could that be because it's us calling because we already know that they're likely to be leaving, and that's why we're actually driving that behaviour by contacting them, as opposed to that being something that's because we're annoying them with our marketing efforts. Yeah. So try to ask questions that go against your initial interpretation of those kinds of results.
Yeah. Did you see the poll results there? So
yes. So I don't know if everybody else can see it, but yeah. Marketing certainly right up there, which is also a big overlap to big data. Recruitment and capital planning, mergers and acquisitions is in 9%. So all of the above is 61%. So that's the overwhelming result, is all of the above. So forecasting can benefit everywhere by the sound of it. Yeah,
and I've just had a question come through. How do you build the right team for super forecasting, and what would you say the general skills are required? I know you kind of touched on that before as well.
Look, I think the best way to identify your super forecasters is to actually run tournaments. So it would be relative, and this is exactly how they did it within the Good Judgment Project. What you could do is within your organisation, you could have something similar to your footy tipping, but make it relevant to the particular business you're in. And you set up a set of questions and let people log in and give their best shot at giving estimates of the likelihood of those outcomes. And then as the actual events occur, you will start to get a leaderboard and you'll start to identify who are really good super forecasters within your organisation. And it might be frustrating for the senior executive, but some of them might be the, some of the lowest paid employees in the organisation. Doesn't really matter. The key is that they've got that skill set, they've got that mindset that allows them to keep their open mind and to keep on second guessing themselves and improve their quality of their forecasting. And then once I've got my group of forecasters, super forecasters in an organisation, I would then embed them with all of my other forecasters, my professional forecasters. So if I've got a bunch of people whose job it is to try and forecast how much this particular commodity is going to be utilised within China over the next 5 years, I would throw my identified super forecaster in there and get them to mix it up. Now, obviously, you can come to PwC and we can give you some of those people. We have access to super forecasters already, but not everyone's in that game. But doing your own tournament would help you identify your own super forecasters within your own organisation. And it's likely you've got some. And then you might throw them into a recruitment selection panel, make sure that they're asking the questions, about whether or not these particular recruits are likely to be future high performers, and always changing up the status. And the skill sets, really, we've all got the capability. It just needs you to realise that you're human like everybody else, realise that your brain is not a computer, and that you need to undertake techniques to improve yourself. You can do plenty of online type training to improve your using techniques to overcome your own human cognitive biases, and you can work to get those kinds of training undertaken. Once again, I know this sounds like an ad, but PwC has those available to you if you want to go that way. And what we found is that everybody benefits from doing this kinds of training, which overcomes your cognitive biases. You'll see it's being used quite a bit lately in the area of racism and also gender equity, making people realise that, hang on, when I go through this particular test, I can see, even myself, I like to think of myself as a egalitarian, and yet I have this intrinsic bias against, say, women in an executive position talking about something. It becomes obvious to you when you go through a particular test, and it's unbelievable. But even the women themselves have that problem as well. So it's something that's innate. It's part of our irrational brain. You have to accept that you're human, and you have to undertake things using your front brain, the rational part, the one that's lazy, but can do the rational, the logical thinking. You need to train that up and employ it when it's most valuable. Does that answer the question?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on. So given that, looking at the industries, you can see how just about every industry would benefit from getting better at forecasting. I think it sounds like, given that 61% said it was everybody, I don't need to labour this too much, but just about everything you can see. I'll leave this for you to go through yourselves, but demand forecasting is obviously very important. Project forecasting is very important. Assessing applicants, investing in capital planning, all of these things, very, very large quantities of money, and all of these things could benefit from improved forecasting. Once again, not to get perfect. You can't expect that you will know exactly what's going to happen in 6 months' time. Try and estimate what the spot price of iron's going to be on June 20th, close of business on that June 20th. You're not going to know, but you can improve and get closer to that by using the techniques you've seen today. And the functions in the organisation, these were some of the ones that you saw in the poll, and I agree with the audience that the vast majority of these would be valuable. Okay, so what should you do? So if you do have data and it's of value to you, use the analytics, because if it's in that area, in that realm on the left-hand side where it's a solvable problem, go for it. Why not use the data? We don't do it as much as we think, and I'm pretty sure most of the people in this audience would know that. That we've got a lot of dark data out there that we're not analysing. There's a lot of value in those analytics, so use it when you can. However, for the vast majority of situations, you need both. You need a bit of big data and you need a bit of super forecasting. They can work together. The super forecasters, if you haven't got one of those great big data people who are just great at second guessing themselves and constantly changing and constantly asking themselves whether they've got the hypothesis right. If you haven't got one of those, but you've just got someone who's really good at stats or really good at coding, throw a super forecaster in, and that'll make that team more powerful. And at the same time, super forecasters on average are not people who are, big data experts. So throw your big data experts and your SMEs at a super forecaster, and you'll improve their ability to forecast the future as well. So they can help each other out. So I think it's probably not a bad time. We've probably got about 5 or 10 minutes left where we can ask questions.
Yeah.
So I thought that's probably not a bad time to wrap it up in terms of the presentation.
Yeah. Got one through from David here. Does super forecasting make use of BI?
In terms of the way it's been done by the Good Judgment Project, there's a couple of ways you could say yes and a couple of ways you could say no. So firstly, the way that they say yes is that they've used BI in terms of assessing the performance of the actual super forecasters. So the way they were able to take the Breyer scores and they were able to do an analysis of who was doing best and therefore identify who the super forecasters were, well, obviously that's a form of business intelligence that's being utilised there. They also used statistical analysis in order to identify what the attributes were of those particularly high-performing super forecasters. So in that way, yes. But in terms of the actual forecasting itself, surprisingly little was actually BI. They did use a little bit of mathematics, but it was really back of the envelope stuff. There wasn't these incredibly complex statistical algorithms that doing clustering or doing tensor calculus or anything like that to try and work out the little movement of information within that noise that could be detected. It was just back of the envelope. What do we reckon? What's the probability? Bayesian techniques were certainly utilised, but once again, not big Bayesian models that you might think of from a big data perspective, but pretty much just the kind of probability where this particular thing happened given this standard Bayesian type techniques there. So in that way, the answer is no in the forecasting, but yes in the determination of who are the best forecasters.
Great, fantastic. Peter, did you want to add anything today?
I was just going to throw a question at Jeff.
Yeah, fantastic.
And just for clarity, and that is, what percentage of statistics are made up, Jeff?
I think it's 52.6% at my last calculation, mate.
Great answer.
Fantastic. Look,
that's a great topic today, Jeff. I think for me, like for predictive analytics in business, people are looking to either save money or grow revenue, and I think you've really enlightened us on some many different applications of forecasting that are not necessarily coined in those two purposes.
Yeah, definitely, and I think it's new content and it's a very, very deep level, and I really appreciate all the work you've put into this, Jeff. It's been very enlightening for myself as well.
Well, I hope everyone's enjoyed it, and hopefully there's some links back for questions for me if anyone wants to ask anything later. But it's been a pleasure.
And I'm getting a lot of people from the audience thanking you for your time and for the presentation. So, look, we might stop that for there today. And like I said, Jeff, Peter, really appreciate your time putting all this together, and look forward to talking to you shortly.
Good on you. Thanks, Ross.
Thanks, guys.
Jeff.
Take care. Have a good day.
Thanks, guys.
Bye. See you, everyone.